Let's go ahead and look at Columbus. All right, Columbus takes his first journey in 1492. And it's important to know where exactly Columbus came from. Columbus came from, he was a businessman, right? He came from the city of Genoa in northern Italy, which kind of sat at the crossroads of a lot of trade routes, including the Silk Road. He was from a family of weavers, right? And he grew up in this merchant city of Genoa. You know, he was used to the business, the comings and goings, the wheeling and the dealing that was common in this late medieval trade city. And Columbus himself, other than being a visionary sailor, and he was a great sailor, he was a great mariner. In fact, he won great glory for himself fighting in the last battle of the Spanish Reconquista, Granada, right? So he had won a lot of accolades as a mariner, but he was also a very savvy businessman. And he had this idea that he wanted to outfit an expedition to sail west, right? You know, the technology hadn't existed 100 years prior, but in the meantime, the Portuguese had adapted the astrolabe from the Arabs, and they had developed the caravel. Now, at last, European sailing vessels could sail far away from the side of land and know where they were, because they have these new sophisticated navigation tools. So Columbus, like a lot of people in his day, wanted to know what was out there if you go west, right? And, he knew that the world was round. In fact, most educated people at the time would have known that the world was round. Aristotle made a map of the world that presupposed that it was a globe. Ptolemy, I think, is generally given credit for understanding the spherical nature of the earth, right? So, it wasn't crazy. Very few people, maybe some really ignorant people, right, thought that he would have sailed off the edge of the earth. Something was out there. What they did not know was that a continent lay between Europe and Asia, right? And of course, Columbus, maybe he never really quite figured out that he hadn't just landed on some landmass off of the coast of Southeast Asia. But nevertheless, the idea was to sail west. Thing of it is, though, Columbus wasn't just looking for someone to outfit his expedition and to pay for it. He was looking to make money for himself as well. One of the reasons that the monarchs that Columbus approached before Ferdinand and Isabel rejected his plans was because Columbus had a demand of them as well. He wanted 10% of the profits. You pay for me to go to the New World. You pay for me to outfit a crew and to, get the ships necessary to sail to the New World. I'll captain those ships, but I want 10% of the profits for myself. And in fact, he also claimed that he should earn 12.5% of the profits for all Spanish expeditions to the New World, right? So Columbus was trying to figure out an angle where he could earn 25% of the profits coming out of the New World for him, Columbus, personally, right? Columbus also demanded that he be given a title, a noble title that he could pass on to his children, right? Well, Ferdinand and Isabel, who were, in Spain, they'd recently married, they'd recently reunited Spain, or actually united Spain, to be more accurate. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. These two kingdoms were united the same year that the Muslims were expelled from Spain. And Columbus is able to take advantage of their largesse to get them to fund his trip to the New World. So he departs on, it looks like August 31st, 1492. And if you notice, he doesn't sail due east. If he had, due west. If Columbus had sailed due west from his departure point, he would have actually arrived in Virginia. But instead he went south, right? Now, why did he do that? Because he thought that there were more riches to the south. Remember, Columbus, he's a businessman. According to Aristotle, as far back as the ancient times, Aristotle had theorized that the greatest riches, the greatest natural resources, the gold, the silver, the ore, were to be found more commonly the closer you get to the tropics, right? So he wanted to sail south. He also believed that the people there would be more pliant and would be more willing to help him. Also according to very early sort of like hierarchies of the world's people that were proposed by people as early as Aristotle, right? So he sailed south on purpose, right? He thought that he would find more riches if he went further south. And of course, he does. Where he lands in October of 1492 in the Bahamas, and ultimately he sails around the Caribbean. We're not entirely sure where all he visited, but he probably went to San Salvador, Cuba, and most significantly, the island of Hispaniola. In 1492, he actually named it La Isla Española, right? Becomes Hispaniola after that. Because, of course, the Spanish island. He's claiming it for the king and the queen. He captured quite a few people, sent them back to Spain in order to show off the indigenous people, and also as sort of a promise that maybe we could bring some of them back as slaves, right? The Portuguese had done that about 50 years earlier after they had started plying the coast of Africa. They had brought back enslaved people to Portugal to demonstrate to the king that there were a lot more people there that could potentially be enslaved. And most historians believe that's why Columbus sent these indigenous Taino people from from the island of Hispaniola back to Spain. So, in any case, it was a tremendously successful thing, right? He left in October, came back the next March, and he had sailed across the ocean successfully, discovered, quote unquote, it's like me going to New Jersey for the first time and saying I discovered New Jersey, right? But he had found these new lands and people celebrated him. It was a great feat. People were celebrating and marching in the streets. When he finally reported back to Ferdinand and Isabel, of course he gets down on his knees and, in front of them, but they say, hey, bring this man a chair. We want to sit together and hear all of it. So here he is, this merchant's and weaver's son from Genoa, now sitting on a chair not equal, but at least at an equal level, as the king and queen of Spain, right? Pretty amazing story for Columbus there. And they want to hear all about his exploits. Now, the person who is a little bit more skeptical of old Christopher Columbus is Isabel. Isabel is not entirely sure about, the admiral's plans here, but he is able to convince the Spanish monarchs to allow him to return. And this time when he goes back, the island of Hispaniola is at the center of his plans, right? It is at the center of his plans. He's going to make this second trip back to the Caribbean, and he's going to look for gold and anything of value, including slaves, to ship back to Spain, to enrich the kingdom, but also, of course, to enrich himself, right? So Columbus is out there. Now, when he gets back to the island of Hispaniola, he encounters the native Taino people, and he notices that they have little shiny things in their ears and in their noses. Upon closer inspection, it's gold foil. There's a mountain in what is today northern central Dominican Republic called Cibao, which held quite a bit of gold. And the waters would run that gold off, and it would show up in the stream beds coming down from the mountains, particularly after a rainfall. And the native people, they would find these shiny little gold flakes in the water, pick it up and fashion into jewelry for themselves, because of course it's beautiful, right? They might not have ascribed the same value to it that Columbus did, but they thought it was a lovely metal. Columbus sees them wearing this, and it lights upon him. Now, where exactly did you get that from, right? And the Taino show them it's from these rivers here, which flow from that great mountain up there. And of course, the wheels and Admiral Columbus's mind, they start to turn. Sounds like you guys have discovered gold, right? So he's going to start looking for gold as well. He's also going to start enslaving the Taino population of the island of Hispaniola, and he sends them back to Spain. Right? He also enslaves people off of the northern coast of Cuba. Now, he says that his idea is, hey, let's send them back to Spain. They'll learn to speak Spanish. They'll become interpreters for everybody else. They'll help Spain with its goals when they return to the New World. But Isabel is suspicious, especially because more and more enslaved people keep arriving in Spain from the Caribbean islands. They join others in the slave markets. Down in the south of Spain, in Andalusia, there were slave markets. And the people you would encounter in slave markets were Africans, right? Brought from the Portuguese from the coast of Western Africa to the Iberian Peninsula. Canarians, people from Cape Verde and the Canary Islands who were enslaved out of Africa and then sent there to grow sugar. Muslims, right? Especially in Spain, because Spain had just reconquered the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims, the Moors, as the Muslims in Spain were called. They had kicked the Muslims out. Those who stayed were forced to convert to Christianity, and a good number of them became slaves. Right? So there were Muslim slaves in the Andalusian slave markets as well. Jewish people were also forced to convert to Catholicism. They became known as conversos. These were people of Jewish ancestry who were forced to convert to Catholicism in Spain during the Reconquista. Joining them in the slave markets were these Taino people. All right? Now, Isabel, the queen, and some of her allies were not sure about the morality of all of this, right? Because yes, like I mentioned, there have been slaves for a long time, but those slaves were generally captured in what Europeans referred to as just wars, usually waged by a Christian king or a pope against the people they considered their religious enemies, right? In the case of Christians, against Muslims, right? And in the case of Muslims, against Christians, right? So there was the idea that enslavement was a just punishment for someone who raised up in a just war against the Europeans. That was a common idea. But these Taino people, were they captured in a just war? Or, were they really enemies of the Christian religion? In fact, Isabel's saying, why aren't you trying to convert them to Christianity instead of enslaving them, right? And in fact, Columbus, he has all these ideas. Columbus had visited the coast of West Africa, which had been colonized by the Portuguese. The Portuguese, right before Columbus arrived, had overrun the coast of part of Western Africa, and they called it Guinea. You can see on this map here, they referred to it as Guinea. And the Portuguese had built a fort at São Jorge de Mina, which would later become known as Mina, and then later as El Mina. It became the most notorious slave castle on the coast of Western Africa, where tens of thousands of enslaved people from the interior of Africa were passed through before being sent to the New World as slaves. It had just recently been constructed when Columbus, who was sailing around the coast of Africa, encountered it, right? So he was familiar with the Portuguese practices of enslavement, and it occurred to him that, the Portuguese are making a lot of money off of selling slaves. Why don't we turn the Caribbean into a New Guinea, right? And this is actually what he was thinking. These people would be useful slaves, right? And he has an idea to send 30 to 40 caravels back to Spain, loaded down with enslaved people from the island of Hispaniola. Isabella objects, right? She objects to this. She actually, even one ship which arrives, she actually sees it liberated, those people freed and returned, right? So this whole idea that Columbus was an enslaver, when people talk about Columbus Day, we shouldn't be celebrating it. The thing of it is that this idea that Columbus was an enslaver, people thought that about him at the time too, right? So in fact, Columbus is actually stripped of his office as governor of the Caribbean. Isabel has a man by the name of Ovando sent there instead. And he becomes a great enemy to Columbus, right? He becomes a great enemy to Columbus, Nicolas de Ovando y Cáceres, right? And he's sent there by Isabel to become the governor of the Caribbean because he didn't like the way Columbus was doing it, right? And they become bitter enemies, Columbus and Ovando. And of course, Columbus is worried, like, hey, if I'm not the governor, do I still get my 10%? That's really what he's the most worried about, right? And in fact, on Columbus's last expedition to the New World, he gets shipwrecked in Jamaica, and Ovando refuses to rescue him, right? So Columbus has to sit there and just languish. But Ovando was sent there by Isabel because she was worried about the way that Columbus was running things there.